Hi, my name is Libby Peterson, and I'm going to be giving you some information on dyslexia. Right. You are from an Arkansas Public School Board, so welcome, Arkansas Public School Board members. So just to kind of start off, what is dyslexia? So according to the International Dyslexia Association, dyslexia is a specific learning disability that is neurological in origin, so related to the brain. It is characterized by difficulties with accurate and or fluent word recognition and by poor spelling and decoding. So while this is one definition, there are a wide variety of definitions and there is not one that is agreed upon by everyone. Some see both reading disability and dyslexia as interchangeable terms, both in terms of the way that they present themselves and the intervention, and other people see those as important distinctions. And sometimes kind of an easier way to look at it is what is dyslexia not? So dyslexia is not merely a reversal of letters. So a common misconception is that dyslexia is when people mess up B and D or P and Q or letters that look similar and just mirror them. Dyslexia is much more complex than that. It is not an indicator of lower IQ, so if a scholar has dyslexia, that does not mean that they are less intelligent or less academically capable. And it is not agreed upon by experts about the perfect definition or intervention, which we're going to be talking about later on as well. So, the hypothesis of dyslexia. There are many hypotheses concerning the nature of dyslexia and its neurological components, in the same way that there's lots of definitions concerning dyslexia as well. Some possible factors or causes are difficult to isolate, so things like hearing difficulties, visual impairments, life factors like schooling, home environment, or language exposure can all have an impact on a student's reading abilities. For example, all of my second grade students have not had a traditional year of schooling in their life yet, so that definitely would impact their reading abilities, which maybe wouldn't always be taken into account on a standardized literacy grader. So, one popular hypothesis, I'm going to put my camera kind of down here, is the phonological deficit hypothesis. So, this is a very wordy title. Phonological means spoken language, so that means that skills that a student could do with their eyes closed, such as hearing the different sounds in the word cat, like at, or being able to tell the syllables in a word, like butterfly, 3 syllables, things that you could do with your eyes closed that are just related to speaking. So, the phonological deficit hypothesis refers to difficulties with processing spoken words. So when this is applied to dyslexia, that means that dyslexia doesn't apply to just reading. It also applies to things that students hear and speak as well. So this is popular in research, but it's not exactly agreed upon on what fits under this umbrella of a phonological deficit hypothesis. So it's not just letter sounds, which would be again like cat, like at, but also things like recalling telephone numbers and addresses that someone says to you and then recalling those verbally, verbal short-term memory, rapid naming a list of objects. So if you saw a list of things or like a list of items, or you heard them and then you had to repeat them quickly, and also rhyming. So all of this also relates a lot to the reading brain. As I said, but dyslexia is neurological in origin, so obviously the brain is a big component of what we're looking at when we're thinking about dyslexia. Our brains perform many tasks without explicit teaching, and reading is not one of those tasks. So things like speaking, breathing, sensing danger have been around for thousands and thousands of years and are hardwired into our brains. Reading is only 4,000 years old, which is relatively new compared to those other things. So it's not something that is just going to happen without explicit teaching. It needs to be explicitly taught. And skills readers are going to use different parts of their brain than a novice or a new reader. So a new reader is going to use both the left and right sides of their brain working super hard to be able to make sense of what they're reading, whereas an advanced reader is able to have more left brain activity. So what this means is that sometimes there's the misconception that if there's a student who's reading slower or not reading as much or is having a hard time reading, that they're not trying as hard. They're actually most likely working much harder in their brain to be able to read what we're reading compared to a more advanced reader. When a child has difficulty reading, like I was saying, their brain is working much harder. So for example, this word that I've underlined up here, there's a good chance that you can look at that word and know it pretty quickly, the word presentation. If I was a new reader, I would have to be going all the way through that word, trying to make sense of it, and then I would have to blend the sounds together in order to make the word. Whereas my brain, because I've seen that word and I'm an advanced reader, can just look at it and know that it says presentation. So my brain doesn't have to work as hard as someone who is a new reader would to read that word. Another component of our brain chemistry when it comes to reading is dopamine. So dopamine is a brain chemical that brings positive emotion, and when reading is fun, more chemicals are present that help the reader remember the skills and ideas. Whereas if there's less dopamine and reading is not as fun and is more difficult, that means it's going to be even harder for them to concentrate, control impulses, and persevere and continue to read. So when reading is fun, kids want to read more and more, but when reading feels really challenging and difficult and negative, it's even more deterrent, like in their brain chemistry, to help them read more. Now for thinking about assessment for dyslexia, I'm going to put myself over here. There's a lot of debate, as there is with the hypotheses and the definitions, surrounding when and how to assess children for dyslexia to avoid missing readers or grouping in children who do not have dyslexia. It can be difficult to distinguish readers with dyslexia from early readers or readers with other difficulties because, again, we can't take a child out of their context. Again, I'll bring it back to my second grade class. I have a lot of readers who haven't had as much experience reading physical books as they would in a traditional school year if they weren't virtual so much of the year. So that can have a big impact on their reading abilities by second grade. So another important thing I think there is to point out that kind of goes back to a misconception is that similar levels of reading ability result in similar errors. So what this can mean in terms of things like letter reversals is that when I was a young child, probably in about kindergarten, I would write my name is Libby, I would write the B's backwards as D's. That was something I did until I became a more proficient reader and a writer, and then I was able to write the letters the correct way. So just because I wrote my B's backwards, that wasn't immediately a sign of I had dyslexia. That was a sign of what reading ability I was at. And then as I continued to progress, then I wouldn't have as many of those errors. The same thing goes for readers at a variety of ages and a variety of skills and a variety of tests. The more they progress, the less likely they are to make those errors. If things like that are something that persists, then that would be something we would more want to look into. So it's not immediately a cause for concern just because there's one error, if they're especially at a young age where that's typical for their development. So when it comes to assessment, it can be kind of tricky because when dyslexia is defined in a variety of ways, how can we have a standardized assessment for it? Because standardized assessment is often something that people are looking for. So different experts say that dyslexia screening should begin anywhere from kindergarten to third grade. So those of us who work in education know that the difference between a 5-year-old and what could be a 9-year-old at the end of third grade is a very large difference. And that can make it tricky for us to know when's the best time for us to be assessing them, especially for our scholars in recent times who have had an untraditional schooling experience so far. And again, as teachers, we know that we assess our kids all day long. We're constantly identifying their strengths and their areas of growth in order to plan effectively. So even if we don't have some standardized assessment, we're always looking at what they need help with, what they're really getting, how we can best support them. So there's always informal assessments going on. And how that relates to intervention is one important thing that I think is a key thing to take away is that what's good for a child with dyslexia is beneficial for all readers. So that means that reviewing things from a variety of avenues, like writing things on whiteboards and using alphabet letters and spelling it out in sand and forming with our words and with our writing, all of these different avenues of addressing these literacy components is going to be helpful for all readers, not just children with dyslexia. And the more important part is to identify the students who need extra support early. So again, as teachers, we know when there's certain students who are going to need a little bit of extra time working with a different concept before they tackle it. That doesn't necessarily mean to know that we need to have a label written down that they need extra help. We know that they need extra help, and so we're going to give it to them. So that's the key of having trained professionals in the education field working with children so that we best know how to support them. And part of that support is explicit phonics instruction. So like I said, reading isn't something that just gets taught by chance. It has to be explicitly taught, and it needs to be prioritized. So some different components of it would be consistent small group instruction. So small groups can be about 3 or 4 or 5 children on a regular basis. Phonemic awareness is like phonological awareness, so spoken language understanding, but it's related to just the individual sounds. So like I was saying in the word cat, at, or being able to recognize the beginning sound in a word. And systematic grade level phonics with a wide variety of access points, like I was mentioning. Now when it comes to current Arkansas pending legislation, there is HB 191, so House Bill 191, and it states that it wants to hire language therapists who provide specialized instruction for students with dyslexia or related reading and written language difficulties in public schools. And the goal is to create resources for families and educators. This was introduced on April 8th, 2021, so it's a little over a year old at this point in the House. And some of my thoughts on it are that the current Arkansas Dyslexia Resource Guide was last updated in 2017, which, as I mentioned a few times in this situation, a lot has happened in our education system since 2017. That's 5 years ago. And so it hasn't been updated since then, and it has a list of instructional components that are only as specific as instruction in the linguistics, language patterns, and structure of the English language. Those aren't concrete things that teachers can be using to best benefit their children, whether they have the label of dyslexia or not. And for us to best benefit our children, we need specific instructional practices backed by research. And one thing I want to point out is that I said, children with a dyslexia label or children that we just know need extra help. Like I said, we're assessing them all day long. We're pretty aware of what they need most of the time. So we're not excluding children without the dyslexia label, and we're not singling out students with the dyslexia label. So we want to make sure that we're providing support for all students, and we're not singling out children who are having more reading differences and making them feel less excited about reading and secreting less of that dopamine when they're having reading experiences. So the last thing I want to kind of say with that is what's best for readers with dyslexia is best for all. So when this bill is being thought about being put into place, I'm in support of it if it means that there's going to be concrete instructional practices for teachers to have. But the most important thing is for us to just have qualified educators who are there to support our kids and are assessing what they need on a daily basis and providing them the literacy instruction that they need explicitly. And here's my annotated bibliography. I'm going to take myself off the screen for this. So I have the Arkansas State Legislature bill. I have a textbook called The Dyslexia Debate, my definition from the IDA Board of Directors, the International Literacy Association. This is the Arkansas Dyslexia Resource Guide, some common misconceptions about the phonological deficit theory and our hypothesis, and chapter 2 from a book called Imaging and Imagining the Brain. Thank you so much for listening, and have a good day.